we had talked about doing this specifically about the New York transition, and we will talk a little bit about that, but wanted to keep it more general so that we're not just talking about one case study here, but in fact, what could apply to the industry at large and what we're learning there, and also collectively. So let's get this to advance here. There we go. Want to look quickly at the advantages of ATSC-3 for those who are not super deep into it yet, and then we'll talk about some of the nuances around the transition, which is really a separate element from the technology, obviously, and specific to the U.S., while ATSC-3 is actually being considered by other countries or adopted by them, including Jamaica, for example, where Amy and I just were a couple weeks ago for an event down there. And Jamaica's adopted it nationwide, and will probably have it on air across the country in the next year or so. That's their goal. Meanwhile, ATSC, the technology, 3.0, the technology is built in a layered format, kind of like the internet, which is different than most past systems. And this allows independent updates, upgrades of the individual layers of the system over time without affecting others, which is the way the internet kind of moves along and has progressed over the years that we've been using it already. So that's an attempt at a form of future proofing. So we'll look at this layer by layer. First one is, of course, the physical layer, the RF. We're moving, when we go from 1.0 to 3.0, from an 8VSB modulation system to a very flexible OFDM based system, which of course pretty much all the other broadcast television systems and some radio digital radio systems as well use one form or another of OFDM, particularly useful for mobile, but also in terms of resistance to multipath and so on. So a lot of advantages there. And the system itself was designed with an actual mandate, in fact, a requirement to increase the channel capacity. And the target was 30%, and basically they've made that and then some because of its flexibility. But if you hold all things equal, we go to about a 25 megabit per second capacity on the channel versus the 19.39 that we have today with ATSC-1. And the reason I say about, and you see the tilde there, is because unlike ATSC-1, which has a single operating point, ATSC-3 has a wide variety of them. We'll show a little more about that in a second. Great error correction, of course, that's always improving over time. It has since digital technologies, media technologies began. And so we're sort of up to the limit of the moment with that, with error correction, interleaving, time based interleaving, and multiple levels in the system. So super robust. And that wide range of FFT sizes and mod cod settings is how we get that variability in trade-off of robustness versus capacity. We can use a TDM, a typical approach, which is what's used today in 1.0 for multicasting, but you can also use this new layer division multiplexing. Show you that in a second as well. It's a clever new system that is potentially very useful. And one other piece of future proofing is there is this kind of pre-header in the PHY layer called the bootstrap that is is something that will never change, but allow what follows it in the physical layer frames to change over time, and give some identification to what that format of the phi layer coming next is. So that bootstrap is built into the FCC rules, and currently so is the rest of the phi layer, but that may go away as other formats come along. The bootstrap would remain and be there for allowing receivers to be signaled as to what the format of the phi layer frame that's about to be transmitted is, whether it's the original that we have today, the ATSC 3.0, or whether it's something like an ATSC 3.1 or 4.0 or whatever comes along. So it's a way to future-proof systems with some level of backward compatibility. And of course, given that it's an OFDM system, it allows the ability to use single frequency networks and to fill in or extend the signal with lower power, lower tower transmitters. And it also includes the possibilities for multiple input, multiple output MIMO transmission channels, at least a two-way MIMO, cross-polarized approach. Typically, that would be for transmit and receive antennas, which would increase capacity of the channel again. It also would allow multiple channels, up to two channels to be bonded together for an increased capacity option as well. So lots of flexibility in the phi layer there. Zoom through some graphics here. We'll give you the stack at the end, so you'll be able to refer back to it. But you see that bootstrap in this one diagram here. Notice it's a little narrower because it's a 5 megahertz wide signal. This would allow it to be plugged into other systems in the world. The rest of the frame, the phi layer frame, can be either 6, 7, or 8 megahertz wide. So the format, the A322 standard, that covers everything besides the bootstrap, is flexible across those three bandwidths, so it could fit into channel maps all over the world. The A321 standard covers the bootstrap signal. It's always just a 5 megahertz wide. This would allow this to even be eventually pluggable or harmonizable with the LTE, 4G, 5G, well, with the 3GPP world of standards, where a 5 megahertz channel map is the norm, 5 or multiples of that. So thinking ahead there as well. So very flexible and useful. And you can see that there's a lot of potential for doing other things with the bootstrap in the future, including waking up receivers like NOAA weather radar, weather radio might do. But beyond just waking up, it could those wake up signals could be set for sub-localization, so that only the certain areas of the signal, the coverage, would be affected by it as appropriate for, say, emergency alerts or hazmat warnings, those kinds of things. So lots of thought gone into this bootstrap and its relationship to the rest of the physical layer. And so this would allow a lot of flexibility, as I mentioned. Here's the chart that shows the Shannon limit in the blue line, the limit of digital capacity of a RF channel. Canonical kind of reference. You notice this green dot here, A53. The A53 standard is the ATSC-1 collection of standard. Well, it is the standard that covers all of ATSC-1. That operating point there is at a 15 dB signal to noise, and this calculation over here in bits per second per hertz works out to the 19.39 megabits per second data rate of the payload for ATSC 1.0. So you can see right away at 15 dB signal and noise, you get this increase. All these red dots are the possible operating points for ATSC-3, some of them, not even all of them, but and you see right away you get higher capacity. That's where we get that 25-ish megabits per second at the same carrier to noise level that ATSC-1 solely operates at. But you can go up or down from there, turning up the capacity, reducing the robustness, in other words, requiring a higher carrier to noise level, all the way up to 30 plus megabits per second. And that's just with a single use of the channel. If you added MIMO to that, you could more or less double it. If you channel bonded two signals together, you could double it again. And that sounds kind of crazy, but in fact, that's what the Brazilians are actually thinking about doing. Not at this kind of signal rate. In fact, they're doing it at the other end, where you can go down and get into actually below 0 dB carrier to noise level. And that's the kinds of amazing levels of robustness you can get there. Of course, you pay the penalty in payload by bringing it down to just a few megabits per second down in these areas here. But then if you add MIMO and channel bonding, and that's kind of what Brazil is thinking about doing, but at a very robust kind of signal level. Anyway, lots of options and opportunities for broadcasters within the US. All the receivers that are out there can handle all these combinations, more or less. There may be some at the extreme 4096 QAM that is not expected to be used much. Some of the receivers may or may not support that. There is a conformance regime that's being built right now to test receivers on an increasing number of options, including across this whole spectrum. But by and large, folks are expecting to operate mostly in the middle here. And the other cool thing about 3.0's physical layer is that you don't have to pick one of these and put your entire set of contents that are on the channel in that one operating mode. You can have some content being delivered in this very robust low capacity mode, while you meanwhile send other content in the same channel as a multicast, a separate signal, but in this case under something called a separate physical layer pipe, which can have a whole separate set of modulation coding, or modcods as it's called, to allow it to be relatively higher capacity, but at a lower bandwidth. So say something's intended for fixed antenna on the roof versus something handheld mobile. You could have two services operating as multicasts on the same channel at the same time, and they could each have those different parameters of robustness versus capacity. So real flexible there. This is a kind of a graphic on the whole idea of a high capacity, lower robustness versus high robustness, high capacity pipe, physical layer pipe in the same transmission. In this case, a special case, because the video coding that's used in the system allows for something called scalable high capacity video encoding, which would allow you to do a scalable thing where you'd put HD at high robustness, and then you'd add not a full UHD signal, but just the enhancement that would make the HD bring the HD up to UHD. So just the enhancement signal, much less bandwidth than a full 4K UHD video signal might require. So you don't actually transmit it twice. You transmit a base layer and an enhancement layer. And the enhancement layer can be set at lower robustness because it's expected to only be needed by a fixed receiver with the big screen attached in a home location, for example, as opposed to something more robust that's in mobile or smaller screen, handheld, those kinds of options. So a number of different capabilities that combine the upper layer actual content encoding with this idea of multiple physical layer robustness levels. So a good flexible end-to-end system across the layers there. I mentioned LDM, this layer division multiplexing. This is something that's come out of what used to be just kind of classified sorts of radio transmissions where you're hiding a signal under one signal under another one. Now this is in the broadcast mode. That's pretty much all the ATSC-3 equipment can handle this mode, where you would put two layers rather than using a TDM approach like we use today for multicast. You use it across the entire spectrum at once with the entire 6 megahertz channel at once, where you have some level, 5 or 6 dB of difference between injection levels of two different signals, two full 6 megahertz wide signals. And you can see that if your signal is strong enough, well, wherever you're receiving it, you're certainly getting this layer. If you have enough carrier to noise, you can cancel this layer out in the receiver and get this second layer underneath exposed and get both of these. So essentially using the channel twice in that respect. So that's another very cool capability. And then you could put PLPs, separate TDM implementations if you wanted to on either of these layers. So you could combine a TDM and an LDM combination there. And there's a number of folks thinking about things they could do like that for really taking advantage of some of the great features of the physical layer for ATSC-3. Obviously, SFN, single frequency networking, allows you to utilize the same spectrum in over and over within the service area. Of course, there's some limitations in terms of how these have to be synchronized to minimize the interference. And so they each need their own feed, but there is a system developed inside ATSC-3 called the A324 standard that talks about the STL special requirements of an STL that would be a multi-site STL kind of signal that can be sent in a very convenient way to light up multiple single frequency channels across that are high power, one high tower signal, and then add over time individual low tower cells around the coverage area, or to fill in gaps, or to extend where the frequency can be extended outside the a more essentially omnidirectional high power signal. And this is, again, brings a lot of convenience. Any OFDM system could allow this, and of course it's implemented in ATSC-3. The idea too is that you could do this without synchronization and just use sort of an on-channel booster idea. That's not really in the standard, but folks are trying it, and there's equipment out there that can do that right now. I mean, you can do that with ATSC-1 if you have adequate terrain shielding or whatever to allow the same channel to be used, whereas normally you would use an MFN for like translators or something. You can do it in 1.0, but it would cause interference in the overlap zone. So that's where the terrain shielding would help and be the only case where you'd kind of get away with doing that. You can do it a little more freely in 3.0. You'd still have potential for interference, but it would generally be allowed. So, and it would be a lot, you could do an off-air repeat, and then you'd need, proper shielding between the receive and transmit antennas and so forth in all these cases. So it's something that looks like could be a very helpful future element and really get that signal to noise ratio up across the full coverage area, as opposed to just being strongest in the center and weaker as you go out to the edges. And by doing that, it would allow you to operate at the less robust, higher capacity mod cod levels. So the SFN doesn't just improve coverage, it actually could improve capacity of the signal, because you can operate at less robust and a higher capacity, higher payload settings. Back on this chart here, if your signal level is strong enough to get everybody to have 20-25 dB carrier noise, because you've got SFNs and the whole market basically gets a good strong signal like that, as opposed to just those nearest the transmitter, the single high power, high tower transmitter, then you can run your capacities up as well. So there's a lot of interest in this going forward. One way to think about this is putting the SFNs out at the edge and using directional antennas facing back towards the main center of the market, where the typically the high power, high tower signal would be. So, and that's certainly an option that could be done today. And in fact, the FCC has adjusted some of its DTS rules to allow this to be done a little better than it would have been under the traditional distributed transmission system rules. So that's, like I say, something that could come along and be very useful. Now, moving to the transport layer, next layer up or down, depending on which way you're looking, transmit or receive. The transport layer in ATSC-1 and in pretty much every other digital TV system around the world has been using something called MPEG-2 transport stream. Most folks are familiar with that have done any kind of DTV work. Big change in 3.0, no more MPEG-2 TS, it's all IP. And there are actually two different formats possible at the broadcaster's choice. One that comes from the MPEG legacy called MMT, and one comes more from the wireless phone world or IP world called route, in combination with the dash system, which gives you the adaptive streaming that has been pretty standardized in media distribution online in the OTT world, for example. And so we'll show you the protocols in stack in a second, but that gives you the ability to do all these things in an IP-based system. And this allows something that perhaps could be the real killer app for ATSC-3, and it's the fact that it allows a hybrid broadcast broadband delivery. When you think about it, we already have smart TVs today. Smart TVs have an RF input and they have a IP input, either a Ethernet or Wi-Fi or both, and an F connector for their RF input if they're using it, or if there's external tuners, then there's HDMI. So there's a number of ways to get into the box. But in all cases, you're switching between one or the other on a smart TV. You're always taking from one input at a time. What ATSC-3 TVs will do is, yes, they are all smart TVs, obviously, so they already have those same sets of input protocols. You have an RF input, one or more HDMI inputs, and an IP input. with some sort of browser inside the set. So all ATSC-3 TVs are smart TVs. It doesn't require you to use the IP connection to get ATSC-3. It can work just as a pure over-the-air signal like ATSC-1. But when you do get an ATSC-3 signal, and the set recognizes that, the whole plumbing of the set is changed so that it allows not just switching between the RF and the IP input, but in fact mixing them so that the same broadcaster can send content over both of those architectures through the air, over the air through the RF channel, as well as online. And the set recognizes those connections that the broadcaster has set up and allows the receiver to mix the two as the user desires. So this allows the idea of a personalizable broadcast, which you could say is really an oxymoron in a sense. If it's broadcast, that's one-to-many, it means everybody gets the same thing, right? How can you personalize that? Well, through the IP element, you put the specialized content, the personalizable content on the IP side. And of course, the common content that goes to everybody is what goes over the air. And then the user can select from the menu of things that are available on the IP side to add to that common content that's coming over the air, or replace elements of the common content, such as the dialogue language or the captioning language, or add additional enhancements like extra stats for a sports game and so forth. And of course, the user doesn't know what's coming from where in terms of the two inputs, but the broadcaster has this capability. And this is something that just isn't really available, hasn't ever been available before. So, and it allows broadcasters who live in both the scarce spectrum space of broadcasting and the sort of infinite spectrum space of the internet to have both, enjoy the benefits of both, which only broadcasters can do. The licensed broadcasters that have the RF channel in the scarce spectrum, but also, like anybody else, can offer streaming services online, now can do both at once and really put together a powerful new kind of delivery of content. So that's really some of the most exciting stuff about ATSC-3 that's coming. Just a little bit of drill down. This is based on a lot of existing standards in the ISO world. So again, not inventing anything unless it was necessary. Here's that protocol stack. Won't get into it too much, but you see the difference in broadcast and broadband. Broadcast, we've already talked about the file layer. There's a little link layer in here between the transport and the PHY, like you'd expect on the broadcast side. And then here's the choices of MMTP, the MPEG Media Transport Protocol. It's an IP-based system, as well as route, the IP-based system. Again, defined, optimized for one-way delivery, because that, of course, is how broadcast works. Meanwhile, on the broadband side, this is kind of BYO connectivity here, just using whatever internet connection is already there, not specified by ATSC, and then straight up TCP/IP with HTTP again. So this is all right off the page IETF W3C standards. And then above that, you have the specific to ATSC-3 elements of content, signaling, as well as dash-based content that can flow in at a single data rate over into the broadcast side, or at variable adaptive data rates over on the broadband side. And then the fact that they're both IP and they're time-stamped allows the receiver to put it all back together in a absolutely synchronized fashion. And then interactive applications on top of that, again, using pretty close to canonical W3C stuff for authoring, so it makes it easy for broadcasters to get their regular web people to also write the apps for their broadcast. So that's the transport. This really will, we believe, bring broadcasting up to a parity with what folks have gotten used to since we've had digital television on the internet side. So behaviors will be able to be just adapted into broadcast. And in fact, some things that you can't even do on the internet could be done with this combination of delivery methods, broadcast and broadband. Finally, at the top layer, we have all the actual content. Certainly more and better audio and video, both qualitative and quantitatively. But codecs have come a long way since ATSC-1. We're still using MPEG-2 video and AC-3 audio. That's we've about a 4x improvement since then in both audio and video efficiencies. So given that, plus the increased RF channel capacity of ATSC-3, that's why you often hear the number of ATSC-3 being about 5 times more, having the ability to carry about 5 times more content than an ATSC-1 signal in the same amount of channel bandwidth, 6 megahertz in this country. It also allows, of course, more flexibility, more captioning. Captioning, by the way, is not burned into video in ATSC-3 like it has been in 1.0. It is a separate content stream using the IMSC1 format, which again is a web-based version of time text actually developed by SMPTE. And so it can be managed. Again, it could be multiple caption tracks could be sent on the internet, and just one over the air, one language over the air, and so on. And the user could select among them if they have their internet connected to their set. Otherwise, they just get what they get over the air. And then audio is the same, multiple languages, or other kinds of audio like home versus away sports announcers, director commentary, those kinds of things. This above the presentation layer in terms of interactivity, you can also have certain parts of your content targeted so that it only goes to certain receivers. This is of great interest to some broadcasters, lesser so to others, but it is a part of the standard that allows users to opt in to certain groupings of content and get those kinds of elements only if they want it. A lot of this could focus around advertising, of course. So it allows the broadcasters and consumers to have a lot of choices and interactivity that is very much like what folks have gotten used to with the internet, with the web. The great capacity for improved emergency information as well. In addition to straight up EAS alerts, which of course would be carried forward from ATSC 1.0 and that whole regulatory regime around it, and architecture in the emergency alerting community. You could add emergency information, a lot more rich information, maps for evacuation routes, all kinds of school closing data, and so on. That could be set up and only viewed if the user wanted to. If it didn't affect them, or if they've already seen it, they can turn it off. And then if another alert comes along that's has new information, it would again be refreshed, and the user could look at that. And there's also greater accessibility as well, based on the fact that we can do much more with captioning or with descriptive audio as services. We already mentioned the fact that the integration of over-the-air and online broadcast broadband, again, can apply to all of these features as well. In terms of video specifically, for those of you interested, I know obviously some of the SMPTE folks on here, we could currently carry up to 4K, real 4K over the air, although all the sets out there today, that most of them are 4K and do the up converting pretty well. So what a lot of broadcasters are thinking of doing, at least in the early days, is a 1080p, which they can't do today. 1080i is the limit for ATSC-1, of course. So going to 1080p, but adding things like HDR and also the wide color gamut that comes along with that at 1080p spatial resolution, with the set doing an up convert to 2160p. That really looks pretty good, and it's noticeably better than what we can do with 1.0. In the future, the addition of high frame rate could be particularly useful for sports, reduce motion blur and so on, and allow camera movements that really aren't possible today, and so on. So there's that's a whole nother element. The architecture on the broadcast side really would have to come up to speed on routing switches and so forth. But whereas it's a lot easier to add things like the HDR, it's a little harder to get the HFR, but it doesn't take a whole lot more bandwidth, surprisingly. 4K over the air does. 4K takes about 3x of what a 1080p signal would, whereas HDR, wide color gamut, and a high frame rate only take a less than a 1x increase to allow those. So it's pretty efficient to get better video quality. So that's why we're talking about what some people would call enhanced 2K, but 1080p with HDR and wide color to an HD raster really can look very good and stay very efficient. And of course, as we said, we're using this codec, which is 2 generations better than what we're working with in 1.0 with MPEG-2 video. So that's where you get effectively about a 4x improvement with just the video coding alone, added to the additional capacity that the physical layer provides. On the audio side, we can do the immersive audio. We can go with that can give you an increased level of realism. It's amazing how much that height audio, overhead audio can do. It sounds like, oh, just another couple of speakers, right? But if you ever hear anything properly recorded and reproduced with the so-called immersive sound, it really does change the whole sonic perspective. It really adds to the realism of the sound. That goes for even just sports events. Pretty amazing. So that's a cool new feature. And the system is adaptive. There's actually 2 systems of audio that are option at the option for ATSC-3 implementations. Although in this case, the ATSC recommends that a given region only use one. Broadcasters in a given region only use one or the other, as opposed to the 2 options for transport where you could kind of use either, although you probably shouldn't switch on the fly on a single channel. One broadcaster could use one and the next broadcaster could use the other in transport, and that's fine. And as they could in all those mod cod settings and so on. But for audio, and this would be so far the case for video too. There's only one codec on video at the moment. There are 2 two systems involved for audio that are approved for use in ATSC-3, but again, with the caveat that you only use one in per region. So for example, Korea uses the MPEG-H audio system, and the US market has decided to use the other option, which is the AC-4 system developed by Dolby. And in Jamaica, it appears they'll be using the ATSC, the AC4 system with their ATSC 3.0, whereas in Brazil, they've already decided they will use the MPEG-H system, which was proposed by ATSC, although they're still defining their entire system. They've chosen certain elements of it. They've chosen the route dash transport, for example, and they've chosen the MPEG-H audio, and they've chosen the IMSC1 caption system, all coming, and the emergency alerting system that ATSC-3 has proposed as well. But they're still deciding on PHY layer, and they're working on the video. Video will be VVC based, which is the next gen codec that's coming along that ATSC does not, at the moment anyway, support. So lots of options for audio setup. Both of these systems allow you to have either a lot of discrete speakers set up, like a big home theater, including height signals, versus something that's built in more to a soundbar idea, or just a couple of speakers, or maybe some up-firing speakers here that bounce off the ceiling with the height. So lots of options there, and the system will essentially adapt to whatever the user has set up and give you the best quality it can out of the original recording, kind of like the way Atmos works in theaters, whereas it could really reach 64 different channels in the theater. If that theater isn't wired that way, it still works pretty well and just kind of scales down. So it is kind of a scalable audio system. We mentioned, though, besides just immersive, more channels, or the fact that you could put objects anywhere in the sound space, this personalization would allow a lot of flexibility as well. Languages, commentary, as you mentioned, and also dialogue enhancement, which is a big deal. A lot of user focus groups have said that one right there is worth it to me, to be able to pull the dialogue out of the background sound. Or some folks say, they're playing it too safe. I'd actually like to hear more of that crowd sound, and I don't really care about the announcers. So, there's again, the user has some additional choice and flexibility. And of course, again, about a 4x efficiency improvement too. So audio, which always took up less of the signal bandwidth than video, certainly, it scales down even more. So you can put a lot of different audio services on, and both of these systems are about equally efficient in terms of improving from their predecessors by a good bit. So on accessibility, I mentioned this a little bit. You can have accessibility added to give a much better service to challenged users of the service for emergency alerting, as well as just for entertainment content and enhanced improvements and improved viewers enjoyment of a service, even though they may have challenges with either the audio or the video. The fact is, safety can also be improved here. And of course, the ability to do closed captioning and multiple tracks, that it can be chosen independent audio language, independent from closed captioning languages. So lots of possibilities there. And again, this could be considered an accessibility issue as well, just dialogue intelligibility. Improving that, it can be useful for a lot of us who might not be considered hard of hearing, but just would like to have a little bit more in terms of dialogue intelligibility. So that's all possible. The emergency information, these are some examples. So in addition to the regular, just straight up EAS alerts, having the supplemental content that could give a lot of new additional content to folks who are interested in it or who are affected by it. And those who care to choose to ignore it can do so. Finally, interactivity, as we said, HTML5 based apps, the so-called broadcast app that a broadcaster would run when you tune into their channel. This allows the, again, web-like operation, even though essentially you're on a one-way broadcast. You can get apps either over the air or from online, loads very quickly once you change a channel, and then you have additional capabilities, some of which are still being added as new APIs are added. And of course, because this is a web-like feature, that kind of thing, being purely software-based, can be upgraded over time by users to continually increase. And of course, the broadcaster can deliver a new app every day if they wanted to. And so that's done potentially even in real time. And there's a lot of features, some of which we can think of today and others that we can't even, haven't even envisioned yet, that are possible with this platform that's being defined and enhanced as we go along here, but based on the W3C types of technologies. So it's authoring of this content should be really similar to what's already done online, and very useful and efficient for broadcasters to develop it. There is continuing work going on in terms of security as well, because there is a need for keeping this, some of the content at least, protected, and even allowing offering of other business models, a pay-per-view over the air, which it has been tried in the past, never really worked well, but could be possible here with just, say, one PLP, whereas everything else is free to air. Or it can allow just folks to require a sign up to get it, but it's free, so that there can be greater integration and communication to your audience. Again, based on existing web security systems and certificates and so on, and this is still being hammered out again based in the software world. It's easy to adjust and add and update as we go along. And here's just an example of, let's say this is a program guide, a schedule going across the bottom here. We got 4 programs in sequence here. The first program comes along. It's got audio, video, and captions, of course. And then those are in the blue, are over-the-air delivery. And then online, the broadcaster is also sending a second closed caption service in a different language, let's say, and an interactive app. And those are delivered by broadband. So folks that don't have their broadband connected still get their watch TV, basic watch TV stuff. But those who do have the internet connected to their set get these additional features as well. And here's the next show comes along. It's just pure straight up AV and captions. The next one comes along. It's got an app. But then this next one that comes along has a second video option that's delivered over the internet. And that could be just an overlay that has additional content, stats, for example, on sports. A second audio channel, it could be home versus away announcer, or in a different language, English, Spanish. But that Spanish is only delivered on the online version, so you need your internet connected for that. Captions, of course, over the air. But in this case here, the app is also delivered over the air. So everybody would get it, no matter whether you had your internet connected or not. So there are lots of options for the broadcaster, and they can all be dynamically selected, combined at the receiver. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of the technology itself. Pretty high level, but hopefully comprehensive relatively. Now about the transition. We talked about that as a whole separate matter, right? In the US, unlike the first DTV transition we went through a few years ago, most of us will remember that, there is no new spectrum available anymore. We've been through the first transition where a lot of spectrum was harvested and auctioned off to wireless. Since then, we've had another one of those that had no new technologies involved. It was just a pure spectrum harvest for repacking the band to allow broadcasters to perhaps get some remuneration for moving or channel sharing or even going out of business to maximize the amount of spectrum that would be available contiguously for additional auctioning to wireless services. So we're pretty much packed down to the maximum right now. So there's no additional spectrum available for us to do a 1.0 to 3.0 transition with complete new channels. So the way it's being done is through a sort of a channel sharing across every market. And that's been, you've heard the so-called reciprocal sharing. The lighthouse is the term used most often to encapsulate this idea. I'll show you a little graphic that'll help explain that a little bit. But basically, the idea is that let's say a typical lighthouse has maybe 5 stations involved. That these 5 stations get together in a given market and say, okay, one of us is going to go to 3.0 today, and the other 4 will pick up our services that the 3.0 channel it will now, which will no longer be viewable by legacy receivers. It's pretty much everything that's out there. And so the other stations say, we'll carry your content in 1.0 if you carry all of our content in 3.0. And because 3.0 can, as we said, carry about 5 times the content that a 1.0 channel can, it's no problem for one 3.0 signal to carry all those other stations 1.0 content. And it's, if there's capacity available, and this is different in every market, hopefully all the services that the 3.0 channel had on the air before they switched can be carried across the different other channels by the other members of that lighthouse. And so that's the general idea. The FCC had to change some of its rules. This whole 3.0 transition is voluntary, so nobody has to do it. But if you're going to do it, you do have to follow certain rules. Because FCC want to make sure nobody lost any service, no consumers lost any services. So you have to have the station that's now going to carry your old 1.0 content as when you as a broadcaster switch to 3.0, you have to make sure that most of the coverage is the same, that most of the folks who got the signal before will still get it. And if you can't, then the broadcaster has the obligation to, upon request, provide one converter to each household that feels they are no longer served by that a 1.0 service on the channel that's now carrying that content. And they don't have to be free. The wording in the FCC is free or low cost. But generally, most folks have set up these arrangements so that there's everybody hits the 95%, and that's not that hard to do, but you do have to be aware of it. And then there's another round of rulemaking going on right now with a second notice on this on these topics. And this will be likely to have even more flexibility as it applies to multicast, because right now all that the current rules apply to is your main service. There's no obligation to have your multicast services carried. But a lot of broadcasters still would like that to happen, but it's not necessary under the rules at the moment. So that's an interesting again, unique new process. By the way, for those of you who are interested in this, translators are also made very flexible here. The translator can stay 1.0 even if the originating station goes 3.0, or vice versa, if that made any sense. And we're also expecting translators to be less of an appropriate term because it'll probably all be on channel, either using an actual SFN or these on-channel repeaters, as we said, where terrain shielding can allow non-synchronized but on-channel repeaters to use with appropriate loopback cancellation, which has come a long way recently. And so this is an inexpensive way to do that. But the point is, we'll see a lot less MFNs and actual translation to a different frequency in the 3.0 era when we get into areas of markets that use a lot of translators, particularly, say, like out in the Western US. And if you're an LPTV station, the big difference in the rule is no simulcasts in 1.0 are required. So you can just flash cut. And that's what's just happened in Boston, for example. A station went 3.0 all by themselves. No lighthouse, no partner, nothing, just by themselves went to 3.0, and because they don't need anybody else to carry their 1.0 signal, and they switched to 3.0 and now are putting on the content they used to have plus more. So that's a nice little feature of LPTV, and it may be something that plays a role in other groupings, lighthouses, with full power stations. Because of that additional flexibility, you bring in an LPTV, you can have them go 3.0 and nobody has to carry any of their stuff. Unless they want, unless you want to, or that's part of the deal, but the regulations wouldn't require it. So it's a nice way to get a 3.0 signal into your market. And remember, with 3.0, low power isn't as low power anymore, right? Because of the additional robustness. So that could be an important feature, and it may be a reason why LPTV station license costs are going up because they're becoming more valuable for things that they weren't necessarily even contemplating in the past. So this whole idea of activity in putting together lighthouses is really an important new thing. What is a problem, though, when you get these groupings of 5+ stations is, you can on day one say, we're covering the market. We've switched the market over. And yes, in fact, that one 3.0 station is carrying all those other channels of content. One 3.0 station can carry 5, or more even HD signals. And so all of a sudden, you're 3.0 in that market, at least for the main services. The multicast's a different story, but it's the other side of that coin, the 1.0 simulcasts that are really where you hit a wall, in the sense that you may not be able to get more than 1 or 2 of those 5 actually on the air and have all their services, even just their main services, carried across the rest of the market in 1.0. And once you get beyond 2, it really gets difficult. So you're certainly going to probably not be able to, certainly not going to be able to do multicast, all the multicast channels that in simulcast. You don't have to, again, that's not regulated, but it would be nice for broadcasters that are using it. Particularly public broadcasters that use multicast a lot, but even so, today a lot of commercial stations do as well, and are getting additional revenue from those services, and they'd like to keep getting that. So how do you do that? Well, the codec that's in between HEVC and MPEG-2 video, the ABC, so-called MPEG-4 video, is possible to use for the multicast. Regulations don't allow, at least not yet, the main services to be used in it. But most TVs actually, it's anecdotal, but most of the TVs have been tested. They're 5 years old or less, have this AVC built in, and it actually works when you watch a 1.0 service with AVC multicast channels. They just play most of the time, not all the time. So question is whether or not that's going to be allowed by the FCC. At this point, it's kind of looking like it would be okay for multicast, but probably, it's certainly not yet, anyway, for the main service. You may have to take HDs down to SDs, or at some point, you just got to hope that a flash cut will happen, because the ideal situation would be you want to be able to get down to just one 1.0 service in your lighthouse before everybody says, okay, before the FCC says, okay, sunset 1.0. But it's really tough to get up. So if you start with 5, to get to that without having really constrained services left on your 1.0 station, the so-called nightlight station. Possible, but really cumbersome. And so the alternate approach would be to stay with a smaller number, ideally 2 stations doing this pairing together. And you need a lot more of those groupings, obviously, in a given market. But you're instantly at that end game if you only got 2, because you're already down to one 1.0 signal. As soon as you have one going 3.0 and one going 1.0, no problem with carrying everything in both modes. And you're already done with that transition. And so if you could do that in a given market, have stations paired up, they're called dance partners as opposed to lighthouses, that could work. And you could even coordinate the pairings and say, we're going to do it next year. And you set all these pairings up, and then they all switch at once, so that users have a minimum number of rescan cycles to go through. But say, let's look at a 3 station. That's kind of a compromise between the pure minimum 2 and the more typical 5+ larger lighthouses. Here's an example of where they're all operating in 1.0 today. Station B goes 3.0. It has no trouble carrying all of Station A's services, both their primary and their multicasts. Meanwhile, stations A and C remain in 1.0, and they have no problem across the 2 of them spreading up and carrying in the 1.0 simulcast Station B's signals, where they were doing one main, and actually they were doing 2 multicasts, but one of those was HD even. It's possible to do that. In fact, current state-of-the-art ATSC 1.0 encoders can handle 3 HDs and 3 SDs without too much trouble. Now, if all 3 of those HDs were doing sports at the same time, that might be pushing it. So you might say a better practical number is 2 HDs and 4 SDs, let's say. But going beyond those numbers is really tough on any one 1.0 signal. If you were running only SDs, you might be able to get 6, 7 stations in there. There are some cases where there are even more than that packed in, 10 or 12, but they're very low quality video to begin with, and so that's the pain point there in terms of how much you can get. So the limiting factor is the 1.0 capacity across the market. But again, if you keep it down to a small number of stations, you can do it, and then it's easy in and easy out of the transition when it's done. One other element here is that, remember, even with this, the 3.0 station still has bandwidth to spare. And so they can start playing around with data casting or doing whatever they want. And then again, the arrangement with those two other stations, if there's revenue produced out of this, maybe there's a sharing, or that's up to how the broadcaster. There's no regulatory element to that. And then once everything's over, ATSC-1 sunsets, everybody goes back to their original conditions, except they're all 3.0 now. So they all have a bunch more capacity. And that's the reason at the end of the day why we're doing this. It's all of a sudden, yeah, we said there's no new spectrum to get a second channel during the transition. Well, not during the transition, but at the end of the transition, you basically get a second channel. And that's really the reason to go through all the craziness here in this transition, is because that's what you get at the end, basically a whole nother channel at least. So this is really sort of the underlying reason for doing this. One other quickie, I know we're over time, is that when we throw in an LP, a low power station, into this mix that we just did, remember, it makes it even easier, because now you don't have to, these signals, these original signals carried by the low power station, they can just go off the air. They don't have to be carried by the other stations. So in that case, the low power becoming 3.0, and again, it's low power, but you could turn the robustness up so it essentially covers the market like a full power station would. It's got a lot of bandwidth available right from day one for other uses. And so an LP partner in either a dance partner or small lighthouse really can work very well in certain markets. And then when you go back after the transition, in that case, the low power station can start from scratch, and basically you could say it's got 500% of the capacity it had before to start, doing whatever it wants with the service. Obviously, there's no regulation to carry anything during the transition or for its partners to either. And then once everybody goes back to doing their own 3.0, then the LP station can do the same, and it's got a bunch of new capacity too. It could run a couple of services at super high robustness and act like it's not even an LP station anymore in certain cases, depending on terrain, of course. But this is why LPs really have a big role in this transition. And what do you do with that excess capacity? Well, there's all kinds of things, and a lot, as I said, with probably a lot of things we haven't even thought of yet. So these are all being experimented with right now, and some mostly speculative, a few already trying to make revenue in 3.0. So we'll be looking for a lot of development, a whole new industry basically being built up in this area. Couple references to throw at you. Again, I'll get you these slides. ATSC obviously has a good bit of information on its site. Pearl TV, group of groups of stations, has a great a number of nice resources, particularly one called the Host Station Manual. They keep updating it. It's really the Bible for somebody doing a conversion of a lighthouse, and particularly for the station that's going 3.0 to start with. And so that's really a useful piece, and they keep updating that frequently. NAB, obviously, the BIT conference, Broadcast Engineering and IT conference proceedings, have a lot of 3.0 papers there available. And Meintel, Swignoli, and Wallace, MSW consulting engineering firm, has developed their own little site called Next Gen TV Training. Gary Swignoli has been doing a number of these boot camps, as he calls it, around the country. He just did one in Jamaica a couple of weeks ago too, and it's a great resource for those who want to spend a couple of days really drilling down into the physical layer. So sorry we're running long. I don't know if folks are still hanging around, want to have time for questions, I'm happy to take them if anybody wants to.
Mike,
Otherwise, I'll quit.
yeah, Mike wrote one on chat. I don't know if you saw it.
Oh, let's see. I will look. Different audio standards. Yeah, yeah, we're not absolutely sure about that because they are regionally. Um, this is the question. If I guess you can see it on screen. It's do all ATSC-3 sets support both audio standards? Probably not because they are accepted by region. There's no reason to support something that's not going to be used in that region. Now, that's for full-size TVs. For dongles, things that might be moved around, set-top boxes, that may be a different story. But for fixed TVs, generally, you're going to probably only see the system that's used in the region into which the set is sold. And the same set basically may be reconfigured with a different SKU for different regions. There may be other changes too. It used to be things just like even power, AC power supplies, although nowadays those are all pretty much universal. Nevertheless, there is likely to not be full audio support on full-size sets across regions. So be aware of that. There also may be changes in the file layer, but most of those should be supported across different regions. But for example, a Korean set would not necessarily work right out of the box in the US. And vice versa. So those full-blown ATSC 3.0 TVs should be purchased in the region where they're going to be used. Portable devices, quote, portable devices, set-top boxes, dongles, it's kind of an open question. And as I said before, the conformance system that's being used for self-certification right now to get the next gen TV logo on the set is still being developed. It's covering the most commonly used things right now and gradually building because it's really hard to have every feature of this incredibly diverse system, a new standard, have a conformance test built from day one. So those conformance tests are being built up over time. And currently, there's a core set that you have to pass to get the logo, but there are some other elements that may or may not be tested completely yet. So this is a work in progress over the next few years. And a transition like this one being voluntary is likely to take a while. And so that's why we're looking at ways to try to make it as short as possible, but no shorter.
I had a question, and I don't know if you can comment on it or not, but seen some work with VHF channel 6 and having a smaller bandwidth and adding an FM carrier. Is that something you can talk about, or is it kind of off limits?
No, it's fine. It's something the FCC has recently been working on as well, and had a comments period, I think, just recently closed on it. What Fred's talking about there is some of you may be well aware of the whole Franken FM thing, which was based on the fact that back in the analog TV days, the analog audio carrier for channel 6 would show up on most FM radios at 88.7. No, sorry, 87.7, right? Yeah, that's it. And actually 87.75 was used as well, but really effectively going back to 87.7 now. What that worked in the analog days. And so most of these channel 6s that were doing that were basically radio stations, right? And it was a way for them to get on the FM band. And so their business was selling ads on the radio side and selling ads at 87.7, where the rest of that left end of the band is non-commercial, was a little odd. There were some issues of interference, but generally not. That wasn't the problem. It was more a matter of like, well, these guys are acting like a TV station, being regulated like a TV station, but really they're operating an FM station, and that whatever they're putting on the TV signal is just a slide or some kind of loop of video, just to basically satisfy the requirement that they put something on the video carrier. And that was the analog days. When we went to DTV, that didn't work anymore, but LPTVs, because all of these were around the country, and channel 6s were low power, they didn't have to convert until just last year. And when they finally did, they could go straight to 3.0, because going to 1.0 really didn't help them, because there was no longer this separate audio carrier. But 3.0, with its flexible bandwidth thing, that we talked about in the physical layer, turned out that a few folks cooked up this method of putting an analog FM carrier in with the 3.0 digital signal, complete full signal. And so you could still have an audio signal for the TV service in the ATSC-3 reduced bandwidth. 3.0 receivers pick it up fine, whereas the FM radios still pick up now the analog carrier that's inside the 6 megahertz channel, but it's separated from the actual TV bandwidth, which is reduced. The 3.0 physical layer signal is reduced to make room for it, because the audio carriers, you might recall, in NTSC, is up at the top end of the channel bandwidth. So it's actually working, and they about a dozen of these low power stations converted to 3.0 in their market, did this little trick, and are operating now. And so the FCC is basically saying, should we let these 12 stations that we've sort of grandfathered keep going? Should we let others apply, or should we just cut off the whole thing, or what? So there's been a number of comments made from different parties that are kind of all over the map on that question. So we'll see where the rules come down on that. But that's the so-called Franken FM 3.0 model, which is an odd little quirk that nobody, I think, other than maybe those Franken FM operators really thought could be possible, and turned out it works fine.
Oh, yeah, I have a question, Skip. Amy was talking about having some meetings with the networks to talk about content. Now, was she talking about the interactive application of it and things like that? And if so, are there any cool things out there that we could see? Examples of things that people have come up with to use some of this stuff that now is available.
Yeah, I don't know offhand any place to send you to, and most of it's being covered kind of behind closed doors at this point. Nobody wants to tip their hand too much. It's also something that it's a little early, because it takes a lot of money and a lot of hoops to jump through to get any of these new content systems developed and deployed. And when we've got so few receivers out there yet, it's really just kind of still the sandbox experimental time. But that, I think, sharing the learning from those experiments is important. And we know that at least some broadcasters are already doing certain high value content things over specialized channels, not over the air broadcast so far, like the Olympics, Super Bowl, and so forth, that are done in 4K or 1080p HDR or something like that. And so we expect to see that kind of trickle down, just like HD was first done on just this kind of experimental basis on very limited amounts of content, and then gradually worked its way down into becoming more of a sort of a default norm for most kinds of content, even down to local news. So not sure how long that'll take, or if it'll ever happen to the same degree, but it is something to think about. And the interactive stuff is the part that's actually easier to produce, makes more of a difference right away because it's obviously different, and is got just an infinite number of capabilities, whereas for the improved audio and video, you kind of know what you're going to do in terms of channels and HDR and formats and so forth. But interactivity is all over the map. Your imagination is the only limit, so pretty much. So that's why I think that is going to be the area that gets most of the focus on development. And we'll see what kind of consumer uptake there is for it over time. But again, it's a relatively long gestation period, I think, for all of this over the next at least 5 years or so. And the FCC acknowledges that too. Part of their current rulemaking is sort of just doing a test the water, saying, where are we with this transition? What are you guys doing? What are you thinking about doing? Who's converted? Who's not? Who wants to soon? Basically just getting a scorecard on how it's going. And they're going to keep doing that every few years until they decide. And as they go along, they decide to say, okay, the current rules, we're going to liberalize a little bit. And right now, the whole idea of how simulcast does your simulcast have to be? How exactly replicated does it have to be? And so they're going to probably liberalize as we move along. And then ultimately, at the end, the final piece of that liberalization would be saying, okay, if you don't want to do 1.0 anymore, you can shut it off and everybody can go 3.0. And even if they say that, will all the broadcasters do that? So this is a different kind of transition than we've done before. So a lot of new territory that we're covering, and so we're going to learn as we go.
Skip, you covered the lighthouse model very well. Is there any comment that you at this point could make on the PBS model? It may not be public yet, but any comments you can make on how that might be a different implementation?
Well, you're talking about the WNET approach,
and the WNET / PBS model.
Well, I wouldn't call it a PBS model. PBS is not involved in any of this. They don't own any or operate any stations, right?
Right. Okay.
But it's the public TV model in New York. And that's going with the dance partner, basically maybe pulling in a third station because they want to carry all their multicasts, and they've got like one extra SD that may not fit. But the reason they're doing it that way is they're in a perfect spot, a unique spot, in that they're a duopoly. They own two full power public TV stations, one UHF, one VHF, both on World Trade Center, with almost identical coverages. So they could really do the transition completely on their own. And then still have some bandwidth left over on the 3.0 side for other broadcasters to jump in, as opposed to having to have a multi-operational, multilateral, reciprocal kind of lighthouse arrangement. So that's why they're going about it with the pure dance partner model. And but you don't have to own both of those stations. As I showed on the slides, that generic concept can be applied across any two stations that want to work together, instead of 5 or more stations that try to pair up just to say, hey, we got all these signals on in 3.0 on day one. That's the advantage of that kind of a lighthouse. Whereas in a dance partner, you're turning on a 3.0 signal, but you're really only carrying you only got 2 stations on the air. But you're already done basically with the transition until comes time to turn off 1.0 and then both go to 3.0. You don't have to try to go through this multi-step model, which is where the 5-station-ish lighthouse really kind of runs out of gas at some point. It really can't complete the cycle. It's kind of like driving into a tunnel that they haven't built the other end on yet. They're kind of hoping for a miracle to happen in some case, or some rules change or whatever, that you basically can say, all right, we got all the 3.0 signals on the air, but we're struggling to keep our 1.0 up to quality, quantity, coverage matching and so on. So it's just more cumbersome. It's cumbersome on the other hand with the dance partner because you need to do more of them, but technically it's a much cleaner way to go in terms of getting in and out of the transition. You just need to do it in a number. You have to have a number of pairs of stations doing it to say the market's converted. And right now there's a lot to say for saying the market's converted, or at least saying that, just because we need to keep the consumer electronics folks feeling like, yeah, broadcasters are leading the way here. We're the chicken, you're the egg, or whatever. That we'll go out there and put these services on the air, even though we know there's no receivers out there yet. And this is the way the Lighthouse model is sort of well suited for that at the early going. It's what happens later where it gets complicated. And so a combination of some markets that do a big lighthouse, some markets that do a bunch of pairings, those could all work well. I'm just saying a big lighthouse is not the only way to go. And the LPTVs play a big role, potentially more so than a lot of folks were thinking about, at least initially. We're hearing a lot more interest and awareness in the value of an LPTV in a lighthouse or a paired up model going forward. So I think this transition is, we have a sort of a phase one concept on it, and we're developing a sort of a second phase or a variation on it. And I think as we go forward, it'll become more understood and nuanced. And so the transitions will be, I think, a more diverse kind of a thing going forward. They won't all be cookie cutter big lighthouses necessarily.